Welcome, 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 welcome. One more welcome for everybody. Thank you all for coming out. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, lawyers, columnists, philosophers, activists, publicists, writers, reporters, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. We're just trying to get in depth opinion pieces from a variety of thoughtful people from a variety of different perspectives and provide it directly to you, the public, so that you can do this thing that I used to do in high school. It was kind of cool back in high school. It's not so cool anymore. Called Think for Yourself. Maybe we'll bring it back. Maybe we won't. We'll see. With us today is Professor Howard Lavine. He's at the University of Minnesota, driven to discover the College of Liberal Arts. He's the Associate Dean for Social Sciences. He's a professor of political science and political psychology at the University of Minnesota. Let's see here real quick. Okay. Everything's working well. Howard Lavine is Associate Dean of the Social Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts and Arlene C. Carlson Professor of Political Science and Psychology. His work centers on the psychological underpinnings of mass political behavior. He is the author of Open versus Closed, Personality, Identity, and the Politics of Redistribution, Ambivalent Partisan, How Critical Loyalty Promotes Democracy, and the editor of The Feeling Thinking Citizen, Political Psychology. He has published articles in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Political Analysis, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. He is the past editor of the Journal of Political Psychology and current editor of the journal Advances in Political Psychology. His current work focuses on human rights, populism, partisan asymmetries, and the intersection of race and political context on public opinion. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota, a MS in psychology from Tufts University, and a BS in psychology from New York University. Very well educated in psychology. He's also served as the Associate Dean of Social Sciences College of Arts right now. He was the director for the Center of Study of Political Psychology, University of Minnesota. He's also been the Arlene Carlson Professor of Political Science and Psychology. He was also an Associate Professor of Political Science at SUNY, Stony Brook, USA University. He was also a Senior Fellow for the Center for the Study of Russia and the United States at Moscow State University. And he was also assistant professor at Stony Brook and an assistant professor of psychology at Northwestern Illinois University. Very well educated. A lot of his work has been featured in the London School of Economics. Yes, the world famous London School of Economics. He was an expert and helped advise them in a foreign country about American politics and policy. These are just some of the articles that he wrote, helping to explain to others how Americans think in the political environment. And today, this is the book. Originally started off as an article in the American Political Science Review. Now it is a full-on book published by the world-famous Oxford University Press. Professor, before we go on, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct about your bio?
I don't think so, but it sounds like a lot. It feels tiring to do all that. I don't think I could do it again.
Well, we appreciate your time here, and I want to say thank you. What is this book about? What is the ambivalent partisan about? How critical loyalty promotes democracy? And why did you do this study? So why did you do the study? Why did you think it was important? And why did you think it was important when you published this? What was going on? And what does this inform us about how Americans think in a political capacity?
Well, the paper was published in 2005 and the book was published in 2012.
Okay.
Well, honestly, I can't remember. I don't have any clue. No, I'm kidding. So the issue was, this was maybe prescient a little bit because certainly things have moved along in this direction. And I'm speaking about political polarization. But the idea is, and it builds on a lot of political science research over the decades that asks the question about: is there a good citizen? That are there citizens who think both deeply and objectively about politics? So those are sort of two desiderata, right? We'd like people to think more than just on the surface, right? We'd like them to not just think about, say, politicians as people, as the way they might anybody else who they might encounter in the world, but think about what they stand for, what the issue implications of their programs are, and we want people to be able to think objectively, right? So that we have encountered the problem now, going into our fourth decade of polarization. It's gotten to the point now where we think that mostly the issue positions, right, which should be the cause of voters' voting behavior and partisan identification, that those issue positions now come after and follow from the party that they identify with. So people first identify with the party, and then they proceed to adopt the positions of the party based on sort of symbolic considerations that might not have a lot to do with policy. And so we wanted to inquire in a systematic way in the article, and then more fully in the book, The Ambivalent Partisan, about whether there is a class of people and why that class of people exists. What are the inputs to being an ambivalent partisan? And does an ambivalent partisan sort of execute those two desired qualities? Perform those two desired qualities? Do they think more deeply and perhaps more importantly, more objectively about their political choices? And indeed, we find that they do. And we also, in the course of writing the book and in the article to some extent, we sort of displace some older notions that are now widely understood among those who study political science and political psychology about what makes a good citizen. So past, the idea was that people had a hard time understanding politics. And if they were politically knowledgeable or politically sophisticated, that if they would be able to make better choices. They would think in more even-handed ways, and because they understand the structure of sort of elite political discourse, they would have a better understanding of how political choices are structured for them by elites. Now, some of this is true. The last thing that I said is largely true, but it's less important than the first thing that I said, which seems now to not be true, which is that those people who are the most politically knowledgeable, who are most politically engaged, and really knowledge is kind of a proxy for engagement, those people invest their identities in politics. They're not really concerned about what a policy does. They're concerned about what a policy says about them. And so those people tend to be not necessarily strong partisans, but partisans who follow the party. Right? So they are very much of the nature of following the leader. They're not thinking for themselves, as you mentioned, independently. They tend to take the party line. They tend to see what they want to see, which was, these are ideas that were popular back in the 1950s and 60s. So the party identification was described as a perceptual screen, such that people would see what they wanted to see, which would be the good in their party and the not so good in the other party. And we know that partisan fortunes, ebb and flow. Parties both cause and preside over both good and bad societal circumstances. And what we would ideally like to see from the perspective of a well, performing democratic citizen, someone who takes those into considerations and is not blinded by the us versus them nature of partisan politics and of political or partisan polarization.
So the ambivalent partisan, just to make sure I'm getting this right, the ambivalent partisan is someone who thinks deeply and objectively about politics and is resistant to the us versus them nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Okay. And then, but unfortunately, you set out to find out about these ambivalent partisans, who they are, where they are, maybe, etc. And what you found was that a lot of the people who are the most informed about politics, the people who might be the best candidate to be the ambivalent partisan, hey, they're deeply informed, they care. Whoops. Turns out they're the worst possible candidate because they're the most ideologically polarized. I'm more about being seen as a Republican. I'm less concerned about what policies versus the overall image of the Republican Party speaks to me, and I'll just adopt whatever stances they have on different policies versus I critically reviewed all the issues and I read all the economic literature going back to Marx and I studied all the policies. And after a careful, balanced, sober review of the policies, I have come to the conclusion that the Republican Party most aligns based upon policy positions. That's an old way of thinking. Now we're going to, boy, they make me feel the right way. That's my kind of folks. What are you guys for? Apples and oranges? Sure, I'm for apples and oranges too. Is that roughly what we're getting at?
That is really a terrifically concise and articulate distillation, I must say. Let me give you an example that I think is really an analogy that will really help.
Please.
Can you imagine, maybe you can imagine this, but it's, to me, a little hard to imagine. Imagine somebody who has a huge interest in baseball, but doesn't care who wins. People that are baseball fans are fans of a particular team, right? And so people that are engaged in politics tend to be fans of a particular party, right? So the reason for that is that they're using a political party label as part of their social identity, right? So once you kind of connect the idea of the self to a political party, then you can speculate and test some pretty interesting hypotheses about basic human nature. People want to believe that their party is different and better than other political parties. They use their co-partisan elites to clarify ambiguous aspects of the world. What effect is this policy going to have? Well, some people say X, some people say Y. X and Y are opposite to one another. What's the reality? Well, I'll simply delegate my judgments to my, co-partisan, so members of Congress who identify with the same party, or people who are more invested or more engaged or more knowledgeable than me, but who also identify with the same party. And so the real problem is it's hard to generate engagement without at the same time, without simultaneously contributing to partisan polarization, or as we would have said back in the book, shallow and biased thinking.
Versus deep and objective.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to go back to something you had said, and I'd like to ask a few questions about this, because there's some longstanding debates, from what I can tell, talking about political division in the academic world of political polarization. So first thing you said, I'd like to go back to, it sounded like you said we're in our fourth decade of polarization. Did you say that, or did I not hear that correctly?
Yeah, 80s, 90s. Yeah, we're in our fourth decade. So the late 70s, the parties started to diverge in terms. We're talking about elite polarizations. We're talking about a polarization of members of Congress in terms of their ideological orientation. And so the parties were overlapped quite a bit before the 1970s. So you had a whole lot of conservative Democrats, right, in the South, for example, and you had a good, a good sized contingent of liberal Republicans in the Northeast. And so when you averaged them out, the parties were terribly different ideologically. In some ways, the Republicans were more liberal, for example, on race, because the South was a single party region of Democrats. But the beginning with Ronald Reagan, the parties began to take more ideologically coherent positions. And so liberals within the Republican Party were replaced by conservatives, and the Southern Democrats were replaced by conservative Republicans, and the liberal Republicans in the Northeast were replaced by liberal Democrats.
We've heard about that. There was, I forget the technical term, but you used to have the two parties and they had some overlap, liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats, and now we've done this.
That's exactly right. There is actually no overlap. The most liberal Republican is to the right of the most conservative Democrat, at least in the way that scholars in political science who estimate the ideological orientations of members of Congress do it.
You wrote the paper in 2005, I believe, in the book around 2010, I think, or 2012. Has political polarization gotten worse since 2012, in your opinion?
Well, there's one guy that came along, I forget his name, ran for president. Actually, was Trump. That's who I'm thinking of. Donald Trump. So Donald Trump didn't, I mean, there's the question of whether Donald Trump was an accelerator or was he someone who created a new way of either people seeing politics or structuring politics. And the answer that I think most of my colleagues would agree with is that he accelerated divisions that were long standing. But he did do some things, given who he is, that political scientists find to be significant. One of them is the idea that the Republican Party currently benefits, as the Democratic Party, for example, did in the 19th century. The Republican Party demonstrates or benefits from priming racial resentment among whites, and it was thought to be the case that if a politician appealed to white voters in an explicitly racist way, that would backfire. In fact, there are lots of studies showing that exactly that what would happen, and that the way to influence voters, that is the way to get racially resentful white voters to vote Republican, was to implicitly prime them or indirectly prime them.
Dog whistle.
Dog whistle. Right. So there are books written by political scientists, by law professors, by others who advanced a pretty consistent base of evidence that implicit messages work quite well. Explicit messages, at best did nothing but often backfired. What Trump came along and did was make, I don't want to say anything that seems partisan, but make racism great again.
Meaning, right. Go for it. Yeah. Yeah.
So
be honest.
The more recent studies in the Trump era now show no difference in the effectiveness of implicit versus explicit appeals to race, and both work. Now, there probably is one that would offend more voters than persuade them, but there are interactions that such that it might not just be Trump. It might be Trump versus that the country has reached a level of immigration that it had reached before in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, where American-born citizens tend to want less immigration, want fewer immigrants, and so Trump. The other possibility is that Trump accelerated what had begun under Richard Nixon, right? The idea that elite political conflict was not only going to be about the New Deal, about more versus less government spending, a stronger versus a weaker social safety net, but it was also going to be about social issues, primarily in the 1960s, civil rights, racial issues, and that as decades sort of went by, that second sort of intersecting dimension, the second dimension of politics, at the mass level became increasingly important. Right? So these are issues like gun control and abortion and LGBTQ issues, and these began to become more important, probably in the late aughts. Especially among Republican voters. A lot of non-college educated white voters who were Democrats were attracted over these decades to the cultural positions and the sort of cultural symbolism that the Republican Party was making visible as part of its party brand. And at the same time, educated Republicans were moving out, and this occurred in beginning during the second Bush, the second administration of the second Bush, Bush two,
Yeah.
2004. And so now we almost there's almost a conversion among the parties, at least with sort of headline economic issues, right? So that nobody wants to say anymore that we need to reduce Social Security or Medicare. People don't want to talk about lowering taxes for the wealthy. A lot of that now is unpopular in both parties, and Republicans don't want to talk about that. So there has been more and more of the the conflict, the partisan conflict, shifted onto social and cultural issues.
Okay.
Right. So that's made education, educational level, kind of a relevant indicator. Now that's something that, meaning that if you are college educated and you weren't a Democrat, you probably became one. If you were a non-college educated Republican, you probably became one. We call that sorting.
Thank you.
In the sense that there is a strong relationship between educational level and whether you're a liberal or conservative on these cultural and social issues.
So there started to be, correct me if I'm hearing this wrong, but with the second term of George H.W. Bush in around 2004, you started to see some sorting of Republicans, or at least the party started to be shifting from strictly policy discussions to social cultural values or impressions. Is that right?
You got the timeline right, but it wasn't shifting from, well, maybe you could say that it was shifting from instrumental issues on average to symbolic issues on average, but both economic and social issues have both instrumental and symbolic components. But I think it's largely accurate to say that the public has been responding increasingly in presidential elections to the cultural and social issues that the parties disagree on. The economic piece is more and more a question of is the economy performing well, or is the economy in decline or in recession during an election? So that can have an overall effect on voters, but it's not policies per se. So the economy works, as a performance issue, whereas the cultural and social issues they tend to work as preference issues, or in more symbolic identity related ways. And these are more hot button ways, easier ways to get people who might not be interested in listening to a policy debate, on NPR, to get them to be interested in politics. And indeed, Trump did, among other things, increase turnout among white non-college voters.
Yeah, he did. He did. I think it's interesting you're bringing up the second term of Bush, of W. Bush Jr., to say kind of a shift to symbolic issues. I remember that election, and I remember him versus Kerry, and I remember it came down to a picture of W in kind of Wranglers and a cowboy buckle and a T-shirt on a ranch. They were showing very popular at that time. And the picture they had for John Kerry was him in surf shorts on a surfboard in Massachusetts surfing. And I'm sort of in the conservative Central Valley, and that made all the difference. They were just like, do you want this hippie surfer or this real working man? And I remember being shocked that most people that I knew were making their decision off a picture.
Well, I don't know if that's entirely, that's a journalistic impression, but there is some evidence, that these sorts of things for low information voters can make a difference. It was a similar thing in 2000, right? Who did you want to have a beer with?
Right.
Condescending know-it-all, or an average guy with a good sense of humor.
Right.
But I will say that I cannot neither confirm nor deny what you say about 2004, because I had a 2-month-old.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I tried to watch, the election, but I do have an image of Kerry. Uh, uh, what is it called? Not surfboarding, but whatever it's called that he does, stands up with a surfboard. And I think what the Republicans had said that even his leisure activities, lead to swings and flip flops. There was some connection to the idea.
Oh, that's right. They were, yeah.
That's my kind of inchoate impressions of an election with a 2-month-old.
Yeah. There was also the Swift Boat Veterans for Justice. And although it was not true, they tried to paint John Kerry out as some sort of like deserter while Bush was seen flying a jet aircraft onto an aircraft carrier. And I remember that was another juxtaposition. And then it came out after the election that they lied about John Kerry. He had a good service record. It was just, they wanted a different image about it. And they found some veterans who were willing to lie about him. So,
well, politicians lie, and it turns out that lying almost never has a big price tag.
True. I just was shocked to see veterans do it. I mean, I know they're people too. It's just sad.
Everybody's, just as a kind of an anecdote about this, Teddy Kennedy's chief of staff, I forgot her name, something Cahill. She wrote to the Bush campaign. She was I think, manager of Kerry's campaign, and said, "Listen, would you please stop running these Swift boat ads? They're really hurting us." And I think the Bush campaign wrote back and said, "That's the purpose. To hurt you."
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that went over well. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe he thought he could fix it like with Chappaquiddick. Let me ask you a couple questions that I've heard from other professors, and I'd like to get your opinion. Do we go left or do we go right on this?
Yeah.
So the first one is, I think you're getting at this, but there's two opinions. One, America was perfect and we had no problems. And then Trump came and he personally broke everything, but everything was fine before him. The other one is we were already having significant levels of political division before that guy. He never could have been elected 10 years earlier. Things had to be a pile of ash for him to step on top of, and then he could push it a little bit further. He didn't just make the climate all his own. There had to be a certain amount of division for him to even come in and win. America wasn't polarized enough at earlier periods to elect him. Which one seems more accurate to you, Professor?
Well, I will say that I think I'd put it in slightly different terms, but
please,
within the context of the two, positions that you've just said, I'd say that it did require a certain amount of acceleration, but it isn't to say that has accelerated party polarization. But it isn't to say that Trump couldn't have come around, earlier. I mean, maybe not, because parties tend to not win 3 consecutive elections in a row. So if you have Republicans winning from 2000 2008, you're going to have a Democrat in there, and that Democrat, Obama, had 2 terms. But I think it is true that Trump ran when the ground was set for polarization. And it was set not only for polarization, but it was also set for the relevance of race. And so there's really good evidence that before Barack Obama was president, American politics wasn't nearly quite as racial. Racial meaning, I guess, 2 things. One, that racial issues and racial priming were not as pronounced, and black-white differences in voting behavior were not quite as extreme as they were in the Obama era. Black turnout was higher in the Obama era, and so I guess Trump brought a couple new things to the game. I mean, in sort of maybe fairness to him, I mean, he did seem to represent people who felt unrepresented. These are people who are more populist than conservative, people who wanted to shore up the social safety net at the same time that they wanted fewer immigrants, and generally held negative attitudes toward toward out groups. And so this was a combination that sometimes is referred to as the sort of populist policy motivation. And very few Republican politicians, at least on policy, had taken such positions,
So boldly.
in a full-throated way, and he did, and he kind of swung the brand of the party from, kind of being a libertarian, well, not a libertarian party, but from a conservative party, in the sense that, the party was conservative both on economic and social issues, to a populist party that was more open to a larger social safety net, at least for native-born citizens.
Fair.
And I think Trump, caught on to something that perhaps the Democrats had let go of, and the Republicans were never terribly interested in, which was the economic displacement of factory workers, mostly through automation, also through offshoring, through the entrance of China into the World Trade Organization. So there was a group of voters who I think were attracted to his message, that they had been sort of cheated out of what were middle class jobs. But those jobs really had dried up a generation ago, so they mainly affected older people, I would surmise.
I've heard that. I've heard globalization may have caused some of the polarization. And I do recall what you're talking about with the Obama presidency. So race didn't seem to be as big an issue. And I remember when he got there, everybody thought, oh, it's a post-racial society. And then you had the senator or congressman during Obama's first presidential address, you lie, right? And there was a guy from South Carolina, and he was Caucasian, and you knew there was some racism behind there, although he didn't say it. So Trump didn't make that guy say that. Then I know Trump was behind the birther thing, but boy, did the Republicans love that for years. I mean, we saw other mainstream Republicans talking about the birther thing, not criticizing Trump for doing it. They didn't know he was going to run for president, but they didn't criticize him, and they carried water for that. That Trump didn't make those Republicans do that. And then I also remember the Tea Party, which rose out of opposition to Obama. And you couldn't say that they rose explicitly out of racism, but there was some hints there. Why are you going back to 1776 when almost everybody was white and our understanding of patriots was white? And why are you bringing up old costumes now instead of when we're on the verge of a new thing? And they also did the thing where their first Tea Party rally was on Martin Luther King's birthday, and they held it in DC, which was seen as a huge slap in the face to African-American people, because these were the people talking about birtherism, right? And then they just happened to show up on MLK's birthday talking trash about Obama. I mean, it was clearly intended, but that wasn't at Trump's level. But Trump didn't make any of those things happen. And then I also remember,
good point, he didn't make any of those things happen. They occurred independent of him.
Yeah,
it really was simply the fact that Barack Obama was African-American. But there's lots of careful studies and evidence showing that the relevance of race and racial attitudes increased during the Obama era.
I remember the Miss America pageants I remember when Trump got elected, and they go, oh, he's making America racist. And I go, really? Let me take you back to two different Miss America pageants during the reign of Barack Obama. There was Miss America, and her parents were from Lebanon. She was either born here or came here as a 2-year-old. She was an American girl, talked like a Valley girl, dressed like girls here. Grandma, grandpa came over there, or she came over as a baby. Then a few years later, there was an Indian girl. Her parents, same thing. They came from India. Either she was born here or she came over here as a baby, talks like an American girl, dresses like an American girl. These are American girls. They win Miss America. The news has to report, mainstream news, wow, the amount of social media backlash is so intense against both of these from people throughout the South and the Midwest and the Heartland. And it's basically, why don't you put the cloth back on your head and get the hell out of our country because you're clearly not an American? Donald Trump did not make millions of Americans have those sentiments and express white supremacy and racism against two different Miss America pageants. And I remember the Obama administration was trying to tamp that down because they were like, we're post-racial, and this flew right in the face of that. Trump didn't make those things happen.
No, I mean, Trump did activate racism, and Trump did activate anti-immigrant sentiment. But the Republicans who, I mean, there wasn't a lot of room for Republicans who, for example, or anybody who was racially resentful, anti-immigrant to move. They were already put squarely in the Republican camp. What really moved were people who were low in racial resentment, or people who were who wanted to see more immigration. They moved just in 2016 relative to 2012, 2008, 2004 toward the Democrats. So there can be change on either ends of the spectrum, and the changes on the left side of the spectrum were quite a bit larger among whites.
So there was a lot of sorting of Caucasian people.
There was a lot of sorting of whites, right, on issues, for example, of immigration. So, we modeled this in a New York Times article that whites who were most favorable toward increased immigration in 2004, 2008, 2012 were about 50-50, likely to vote for. They were equally likely to vote for the party. But by 2016, those same people, that is, those who were most favorable toward immigration, moved about 25 points.
Wow, 25 points.
Likely to vote for the Democrats. And you could even make the argument that had Trump not, ironic argument, but had Trump not raised the issue of immigration, he might have won the popular vote.
It always terrified me that it was only because of California that he didn't win the popular vote. When they added it up, they're like, "Oh, Clinton won the popular vote." Yeah, just by the amount of California. And I had to tell fellow Californians, you know what that means? And they go, "What?" It means outside of California, more than half of your fellow Americans like Trump. So the moment you leave our state borders,
well, there's a lot of people in California, so remember that.
True, but they're no more than about 23% of the population at max. I know some people say 25, but we're clearly about 65, 75% liberal. Okay, another question I wanted to ask you was, are the people themselves polarized now? Or is it just the elites? Obviously, I think at some point it started off with the elites, but there seems to be a debate between some professors are saying, nope, the public's not polarized at all. We have these public opinion polls that show 79% of Americans want reasonable gun control law or believe in climate change. And yet, I mean, obviously elite polarization is true, but I see other studies that say in 2012, 1/3 of voters would be offended if someone in their family dated someone from another political party. By, I think, 2015 or 16, it had risen to over half. Over half of the country, over half of all registered voters, a majority of registered voters don't want anyone they know dating someone outside of the party. I don't recall Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell coming on TV and saying, never date someone who's not a Republican. So I'm wondering, are the people polarized? Is it just the elites? And if the people aren't polarized, how come they're doing polarized things they were never told expressly to do by the elites?
It's a lot of that question. So let me try to.
Sorry.
First of all, no, not at all. So that is really the question to ask, or at least a question to ask, a fundamental question within the topic of polarization and mass politics. Well, so there are two ways to be polarized, at least, probably more. One is on the basis of issues. There's a disagreement about this, and so that one answer to that is that people who vote, people who are highly engaged, have moved out to the extremes relative to those who don't vote and are less engaged. That's happened maybe a little bit, but the much larger way in which the public has become polarized is not on the basis of issues, but on the basis of feelings or people in the other party. So they basically simply like those people in the other party a lot less than they used to. So people used to be roughly, they used to feel roughly neutrally toward those in the other party. They like people of their own party. Now they feel quite frosty toward people in the other party. So we call this affective polarization. So
right.
This is a whole cottage industry. What causes it? How can we relieve it? What can we do about it? For whom is it happening the most. And so it's a commentary on what the mass public thinks politics is about. So there was a book published in 2018 called, I think it was called Civic Disagreement, or no, sorry, Uncivil Agreement.
Right, by Liliana Mason.
By Lily Mason, yeah. And the genius of Lily's title, here you got it right there. The genius of Lily's title, Uncivil Agreement, means that we kind of agree with each other on issues. That is the mean difference on issue preferences between Democrats and Republicans is not getting any wider. We are just simply liking those people in the other party less. And so it has to be for reasons other than issues. And so what is it about? It's probably about the sorting of other social identities. And this is, in fact, Lily's argument. The idea, that so, whether you are college educated or not, whether you are an evangelical Christian or not, whether you live, in an urban part of the country or in a rural part of the country, whether you're male or female, whether you're white or non-white, these social identities always were important in American social life, but they were not strongly related to whether you were a Democrat or a Republican.
Right.
Now they are.
I've read that.
Right. So African Americans got the vote. Republicans got the vote of African Americans until 1936, possibly.
Right.
Possibly
That's right.
too. But now these identities are all linked to partisan identification, which Lily then refers to as a mega identity, right? So all the ways in which people are divided from one another were cross-cutting with respect to party identification. Now they are aligning with respect to party identification, creating this kind of summary of who you are. If you're a Republican, we know that you're probably white, Christian, heterosexual, and married.
And drive a truck, something like that.
I don't know about a truck, right? But
out here.
But if you don't possess all four of those characteristics, you're probably not a Republican. So, that is the nature of polarization and the nature of what underlies affective polarization. I mean, so it's it's natural for us to like groups that we belong to or identify more than those we don't belong to or don't identify with.
Yes, Dr. Mason talks about that.
Yeah.
Are we hardwired to do that? It seemed like she was suggesting.
If you want to get, picky,
not too deep.
I mean, but yes, there is a biological evolutionary component to that, right? We tend to be wary of strangers more than we are people who are part of our own group. So our brain, many political psychologists who study evolutionary psychology will say, well, our brains are not adapted to, mass scale, urban life. They're still sort of adapted to sort of, the kind of world of, small bands of hunter-gatherers in which people would, be very groupy. They'd be very.
You're not part of my tribe. You're on the other side of the river. We don't like other side riverers.
The other side of riverers are right. They're trying to steal our resources, and so we should kill them before they kill us. And
right.
So that's not an unreasonable analogy, and it's not unreasonable to think, that our tribal instincts, which are part of the way our brains are constructed, we should not think that that's irrelevant to all of this. It's not, meaning it is relevant. And so we all have tribal instincts, and we tends to require, some deliberative thought, effortful thought to override the way that we generally think, which is automatically, intuitively. And that's where tribalism, that's the part of the brain or the part of the way the brain thinks that brings out tribalism.
It's fascinating.
And what comes after that is, and you mentioned this earlier on when I said, "Oh, that's just a perfectly articulate distillation
I really appreciate you saying that.
of the divide," is that once people have automatically activated some affect that's related, to the parties or to something political or ideological, much of what comes afterward is believed by a lot of people to be simply rationalization. So you ask people, why is it that you are a Republican, or why is it that you favor the death penalty? And people are basically making up answers. They don't really have um, an accurate sense of why they believe what they believe. And there was a strand of social psychological research in the 1960s that hypothesized exactly that
Hmm.
and came up with an answer to that. But it is probably the case that we are operating in such a way that our intuitions, um, which occur very quickly and are felt in the body, then give way toward more deliberative thinking that might occur in the newer part of the brain, but that is consistent with what comes out automatically, which is harder to it's harder to identify the origin of that.
Yeah.
That's a deep mystery, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It has benefits. It has negatives. We've seen the negatives. Some of the benefits, as I explained to some of my liberal colleagues, is the military. They train these young men and women together in a team, and that tribalism helps them become fiercely loyal to each other and willing to fight harder in the foxhole. And that's a good aspect. But there are many negative aspects.
Well, there's another good aspect, or at least a hypothesized good aspect, that political scientists believed to be the case. And this was back in 1950. They wrote a report for the American Political Science Association that criticized the political parties for not having ideologically coherent programs, and so that it was difficult
Oh,
for the
yes.
public to understand, well, what is politics about? What is partisan politics about? Because the parties weren't any different they weren't sufficiently different from one another for the public, right, to be able to understand political discourse, in a way that it occurs among elites, and that's important because elites structure the political choices that we make. We don't go into the voting booth and do anything other than usually just simply vote for a candidate who's a member of a party,
Right.
and so the idea was that polarization would at least clarify where the party stands. One party could become the conservative party, the other party could become the liberal party. Then people could think about where they themselves are and vote in ways that align with their more basic philosophical orientations. Part of the problem was that people didn't really have those basic underlying philosophical orientations. They had incoherent belief systems that had just a
Mm.
kind of a bunch of liberal, conservative, moderate positions altogether. Um, and they ignored the psychological, tribal, possibilities that would emerge in a more ideologically coherent American, elite political environment.
It sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you agree that the people are polarized. Maybe at this degree, maybe it started off as the elites, but there's some evidence the public is polarized now.
Well, there's very good evidence that the public is affectively polarized,
Affectively.
meaning that they don't like people from the other party. They have not necessarily moved to the extreme, so that before polarization, you had a distribution of preferences like a bell-shaped curve, where most people were in the middle. Most people are still in the middle. Okay.
All
The
right, on
means
the
the
policy.
means for people, the means of Republicans and Democrats, especially those who are engaged in politics, have moved a little further apart. But it's not even clear what that means if that moving apart is driven by partisanship,
Mm.
right? So if it's driven by partisanship, then it's not clear that it means anything at all, other than people following the leader, following the party. Maybe that these political positions are not terribly strong, terribly deeply held. that they're simply ones that follow, as you said yourself, from finding out, what the party that you identify with believes, and then you go on to take their beliefs. And so even if the mean difference, on a policy preference scale has increased between Democrats and Republicans, that might just be simply a function of more people are becoming aware of where the two parties stand as a
Fair.
function of ever increasing polarization.
Fair.
And ways of learning about politics. Social media, primarily.
Yeah. I have a map I want to show you, but first I want to ask you a psychological question, and it's a little bit theoretical. So you might imaginary universe, if you want. Some professors like this when I do this. I'm not talking about here. I'm talking about another universe that looks exactly like ours. So you don't have to say I meant for this universe. It's another in this theoretical universe. In this theoretical universe, it's exactly like now. Donald Trump goes to jail. Santorum or whoever's the guy in Florida who's doing great, Ron DeSantis, he goes away. There's no real big Trump candidates who are able to exemplarize, who are able to promote Trumpism or seem like they talk
in the Trump lane or who are Trumpists.
Yeah, they kind of go away. Now, there really isn't a repudiation, but they sort of go away, and we have more moderate Republicans are the ones that are offered. Let's say there's some sort of legal change that changes gerrymandering or something that allows that. You have 78 million, maybe over 100 million people who are, or more, who are highly polarized. Some of them participated in a coup overthrowing the Capitol. Many more of them feel that wasn't a coup, and I don't need to feel bad about that. And it's cool to just that people go and overthrow capitals. That's cool. And, that's terrifying. January 6th was terrifying to people. But the thing that's more terrifying to people, I find, is the fact that the Republican Party has walked back their condemnation, and that many of their followers used to say, oh, that's wrong. And now they're going, well, I don't know if it was anything other than a barbecue that got out of hand. And it's ridiculous to people who are watching their Capitol get stormed to even hear that and hear that half the country thinks that. So let's say the bad elites disappear in this alternate universe, but that's it. Do 100 million polarized people, the kinds of which would participate in January 6th, the kinds of which who would not think that's anything worth criticizing, do they just calm down on their own and start acting more natural over time? Or is there a point where you make people so angry there is no calming them down?
Let me try to frame your question as is this a top-down phenomenon or a bottom-up one? Now, they're not mutually exclusive. They can both be happening. Okay. There is some work by a political scientist named Larry Bartels in Europe who wrote a book suggesting that the populism phenomenon was mostly a top-down sort of thing, that it was driven by elites. And so, in your hypothetical world where there are no elites, would you continue to have the kind of political conflict that you have now? And I think, at least with respect to, the aftermath of the 2020 election, no, certainly not.
Okay.
If Trump had lost and said, I lost, I'm going home now, there would not have been a January 6th. And the other thing, incidentally, I don't think there are 100 million polarized, people. You have 155 million, voters. Probably less than half of them are polarized, and very, very few, very tiny number of them are ones that were willing to, do what they did, on January 6th. And it wasn't even clear what they were doing. So a coup would have to include killing everybody in the building and then getting the army or something to,
we talked to a foreign policy scholar today.
This was sort of an expressive, organized expressive anger. But
fair, but foreign policy scholars consider it a coup. But we can consider whatever we want in America, but people who actually study this at foreign policy level consider it a full coup.
I'm not trying to downplay it at all. I mean, and I certainly agree that the way the justice system is dealt with, at least, those who seem to be the leaders of the insurrection. I do think they should have been treated the way they are, which is lengthy jail sentences. So, I think Trump was unique in that respect, and I think that there are a lot of people who who are a lot of elites who will say, Trump won and all this and that, the other thing, but don't believe it. And I would say that's about 90% of Republican members of Congress, or 95% or 98%. There are a couple who really believe it. Certainly those on Fox News who we now know said the whole thing was hogwash. They don't believe it either, right? So this is merely a performance act that is demanded by the voters. So Trump says, "I really won. You should go over there and overturn the election to keep me in office because I really won." And Trump has the level of influence. He has a level of influence in the Republican Party that no Republican president has had, at least in recent memory. I mean, not even Reagan, even though Reagan won by enormous landslides, and Trump won one election without but by a very slim margin, and by losing the popular vote by 2.5 million votes, and then losing a second election that his opponent won by a sliver in the Electoral College.
Thank you.
By 7 million votes.
Thank you.
So,
about 1.2%.
But he does have a somewhat more cult-like following, and so he has changed politics in that respect, right? That we used to talk about in the 80s. We started talking about candidate-centered politics, meaning that candidates could speak, because of television. Candidates could speak. Not that television was invented in the 80s, but candidates could speak more directly to voters. They didn't require the sort of party apparatus to do that. Trump is a very good example of someone who might be said to even have run, at least in 2016, against both parties.
Yeah, I've heard that.
In some ways, was not an extremist candidate, but was a moderate candidate because he was not terribly conservative on economic issues.
I heard that.
It's a little bit hard to classify other than as a populist.
But so there's a lot of people who think you get rid of Trump, you get rid of Marjorie Taylor Greene, snaps right back together. Can you get a lot of people, at least a couple million? And the reason I went with 100 million is Joseph Biden said 78 million Americans are super polarized to the point of being a threat to America. So that's from the president. That's pretty damn close to 100 million. We're looking at the scale of shocking.
75 million people voted for Trump. That would mean nearly all of them are extremists.
I'm just going off what the president said on a televised address to Americans, which many Democrats did not contradict him at all for saying, and backed him up.
Well, that's the way things work.
That's the way things are. I'm just saying there's a lot of Democrats who bought that and believe 100 million Americans.
Not accurate. It's the benefit of politicians to say things like that. But anyway, go ahead. You have a point.
Sure, but it's also nobody could criticize that. Nobody could criticize Biden for doing that. I mean, that's I hadn't seen that before. I hadn't seen a president go on TV with a blood red backdrop, active duty Marines, and say millions of Americans are basically enemies of the state. That was new.
Yes, I mean
that was new.
No, you're right. No, that was a significant thing that he said. What he was trying to do, and the strategic logic of this, whether it works or it can work or not, would be to say that there is a portion of the Republican Party that's beyond being reached
Sure.
by a Democrat. But for those that are not part of that unreachable segment, he wants to characterize, at least a large swath of the Republican Party as being reachable and being reasonable and being centrist, and willing to compromise and be bipartisan.
Sure.
But he was also, I think, warning people that there was a segment of the Republican Party who believed some very dangerous things that weren't true that would be likely to cause violence, especially with those who follow Trump's tweets. There's a flag that I still can't quite understand, and it says, you see it at his rallies. It says Trump or death.
I'm not a Trump fan. I'm saying 78 million Americans. Wow, enemies of the state. That's new. That's new. We hadn't seen that before, and that was not by Trump. In fact, that speech was criticized by fellow Democrats and independents for exacerbating tensions, and NBC and CBS News had to cover that. I guess the question is, they're pushing this line of you get rid of all these extremist politicians, everything calms down. So I'm supposed to believe 78 million people were called enemies of the state by the president and they participated in a coup. But when their elected leaders go, they're going to go, I'll just calm down now. It's cool. I kind of got out of it, got away from me. Is that reasonable? People think this for this long, these years. 2 impeachments from Trump. Nope, still my guy. Stop the steal. Nope, still my guy. Coup. Nope, still my guy. 78 million enemies of Americans. Screw you, Biden. Well, I got to tell you, people I know like that don't calm down.
You have to distinguish between voters who are voting Republican and voters who are voting for Trump. And it's likely that there are probably more voters voting for the Republican Party than there were who were voting specifically for Donald Trump. But
sure,
there is a percentage, and it's not a trivial percentage. It could be upwards of half who are voting for Donald Trump and don't identify or attach themselves too closely with the Republican Party, at least in 2016. And so, yes, Trump is a somewhat detached, or he is somewhat detachable from the party system, or at least he was. He now no longer quite is. But, if the question that you're still asking is whether it's possible that if Trump disappeared, Trumpism would go away, the answer is, certainly not. Although, there is a performative aspect of Trump's, sort of political brand, in his theatrics and the way that he, his sort of, his crudeness that appeals in a way, that might not be, that could maybe can't be replicated, by somebody else. So, there's a theory of populism that talks about not only being the right time and the right place, but you have to have the right person. The person has to have a somewhat demagogic, personality. So when you look at the people who have been successful populists on the left and the right, they do tend to be colorful figures. So Trumpism might be carried on in a different form, especially the sense that economic issues or economic conservatism tends to be continues to be muted, and culture war issues tend to dominate. But again, Trump jumped onto a train that was already largely not just heading in that direction, but had arrived as the dominant dimension of a partisan political discourse.
That's 2 things that grab my attention is just when I hear people say, oh, it's the elites. Was this Time magazine article, survey of 5,000 people, what was it, about a third in 2012 to more than half in 2020. More than half of Americans don't want to date outside their party. And then there was this by Center for Politics, Sabato Crystal Ball, University of Virginia, Political Center, 2021. They did a survey at a fairly reputable university. 74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel all voters from the other party are, quote, a clear and present danger to the USA. I shortened it to just danger, but the phrase was clear and present danger, a phrase typically used for an ISIS attack or a Russian nuclear missile strike. That seemed bad to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we are,
not good.
To some extent, again, these are survey questions. And maybe
sure.
Were less, extreme, the percentages would be equal, and maybe, it's partially a survey effect. But no, it's not. It's undoubtedly the case that Trump has accelerated something to maybe the extent now that it is different in kind, right? So that what Trump brought to the table was the much more likely prospect of political violence.
Yeah, I can see that.
So that is an acceleration that you might say, was not predictable from, where we were 10 or 20 years ago. But the that might be largely driven by elite rhetoric as well. And so when somebody like Trump is out of the picture, that form of extremism dies with it. If something will remain, right? Donald Trump won't be around forever. He's 76 years old. He might go to jail. He's probably more likely to become president than go to jail, or maybe likely both to go to jail and then become president, but probably not to go to jail. But anyway, he's not going to be around forever.
Woo, who can tell with this guy?
You can never tell whether you get to a certain level and then people back off. I mean, look, the insurrection, called for, let's hang Nancy Pelosi. They didn't do anything like that. They didn't bomb the place.
True.
So, it was, I'm not underplaying what happened. They desecrated it. They were, violent in the way that they, got entry. They assaulted more than 100 police officers. So it's, it's an outlying event that one hopes. It was so unpopular. It was so bad for the Republicans that they needed to minimize it. It so kind of infected their brand, that they tried various ways of minimizing it. Those ways included ignoring it and then editing it so it looked like, a backyard barbecue.
Fair enough. Although I will point out the the shaman. The way they presented him on January 6th was completely incorrect, and footage came out after that, and the guy was completely released, and they shut down their whole case against him in a court of law. Just saying, that's a fact. So, but that's not the one I wanted to focus on. What I wanted to focus on, yeah, that's a fact. You can look it up. QAnon shaman. His lawyer destroyed the entire government case against them, and they had to release him with no charges. So how large is the divide between red and blue America? This is what I wanted to talk to you about. It's called The Big Sort. Maybe you've heard of it. There was a book in the 90s by Bill Bishop. He said people are ideologically sorting themselves out. NPR's covered this. 538 has covered this. Wall Street Journal, New York Times.
Nobody's covered it. It was a big book.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good book, but it was somewhat of a theory.
It is a theory.
Talked about data, present a lot of data, but talked about the idea that young educated people were moving to certain places, and they were making urban America more blue. And those people who were remaining in rural places, the sort of remainers were, I guess, changing the composition of those places to be more red. So it's a geographic theory driven by a congregation of educated people in dense urban centers. Yeah, I mean, and the sort, the word "sort" came from Bishop, and it was used, in a book that was published in 2009 by Matt Lewandowski. And the word "sorting" has certainly been a very popular word to, it parallels polarization. Some political scientists saying, well, there's sorting, but there's not polarization. Others say it's kind of the same thing. But yeah, there's been a sorting.
The
urban America is more blue. Rural America is more red. There was
Matthew,
not even
Matthew Lewandowski, right? This guy.
It was two books
ago, but
two books ago.
Okay, 2 books ago.
That's his newest book. Yes.
This is a map by the Wall
A lot of
Street
good books.
I love that book.
Reading.
This is a map by Wall Street Journal. Came out in 2016, many years after Bill Bishop's book.
You mean the New York Times?
New York Times. Sorry, New York Times.
Okay, yeah.
Well, hold on. I got one from Wall Street Journal on here. New York Times. Okay, we'll go with this one. I have one from Wall Street. We'll go with New York Times. So New York Times came out with this in 2016, and they basically, this is years after Bishop's book, and they basically back up the whole thing. And they say, yeah, he's right. So what they're pointing at is counties that voted for Republican or Democratic presidential candidate by 20 percentage points or more. This was a theme in Bill Bishop's book called landslide election counties. So if you look at the top left, the map at the top left, I know it's grainy, but it'll work. So 1990
counties now.
I'm sorry?
There are many, many more of those counties now.
Exactly. That's the whole point. If you look at 1992, red equals don't run here if you're not a Republican. You'll never win. They win by 20 points. Blue, don't run here if you're not a Democrat. You never win. But gray is competitive. And New York Times is pointing out we've lost all our competitive districts between 1992 and 2016. So wiped out.
If you look at the Cook report, they do a very good job of kind of separating races into being, toss-ups or leans or safe seats. But the upshot is that the number of competitive seats in the House of Representatives, 435 seats, only about 10%, right? Maybe only 40 to 45 or 50 at the most are there you go, are competitive, are in swing districts, and those tend to swing back and forth, on the basis, of the fortunes of the parties, and that was not the case, as you point out, a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And so this has been increasing, and they're changing in other ways as well.
If this has been going on for 3 decades, this sorting, and I get there's different opinions about it. Some people are saying, well, people say, I want to go somewhere people vote like me. A lot of professors are saying it's not that conscious. You kind of look for value signals or lifestyle signals. I don't see enough barbecue joints or hat stores or something, and I move over here that seems more comfortable. And then you start adopting the kind of the voting custom there. And then also what you said, LGBTQ people move out, immigrants move out because they think it's racist. Young people move out for opportunities, and then you're left with old Caucasian people with no minorities or diversity around.
And college education.
Yeah, and Norman Orstein, the demographer, had pointed that out, that that's the way that it was going. So if this is the sort and this map is true, this seems to suggest that the polarization is with the public, because these are at the county levels.
Yeah, when you jump levels of analysis from individuals to districts or counties or states, you don't want to make cross-level inferences, but yes, I mean,
Sure.
at the congressional district level, there are many fewer competitive seats, and that's
Sure.
a function both of geography, of gerrymandering, and other things, largely those two things. So what it does is it sort of stultifies, it reduces the dynamism of politics. When only 10% of the seats are competitive, you're not going to have very large majorities. And what it requires is more bipartisanship. And when you're in an era of high polarization, you can see it now. So what you saw are two things. Recently, what you saw, a highly bipartisan debt ceiling, in especially the House. But now you see that a small minority of the House, the Freedom Coalition, is halting all legislation because they didn't like it. So there are maybe mixed signals.
Minnesota. I want to pick on you a little bit, if I may. Minnesota, according to the maps, was one of the last holdouts in all of America. It was one of the last places that didn't seem polarized, according to these maps, on left or right. And then somewhere around the Trump election, it lost it, and it went total polarization.
When you look at geography, the districts, it's a big state, but a lot of it's rural, and so you've got large swaths of land, especially the 7th and 8th districts are large, and you had large, and it was blue, and there was some red in the bottom, but there was a lot of blue. Those districts have now become red, but they're no larger than any other district. They just are large in size. And so what used to be on the map the largest, or one of the largest geographical blue zones, has become red. So I don't think it means anything. It's just a couple of districts. It's not like it's 10 districts. We only have 8 districts. Probably have 7 districts soon. But it really was a matter just of a couple of districts that were in Democratic hands, 7th and the 8th, northern Minnesota, for a long period of time, that have now turned red. So all that blue now is gone, and so you don't see that big blue swath there anymore.
I had talked to some professors out of, I forget if it was Iowa State or University of Iowa. I apologize to those professors. The names sound similar, but they had said Iowa was also a competitive district, holdout state for a long time, just like Minnesota and Maine.
Iowa swung back and forth during the first, I don't know, several elections in the 2014.
Yeah. A lot of political scientists have looked at Minnesota, Iowa, and Maine as places that used to swing back and forth, and then they seem to go all hardcore red recently. That's what they're saying. So
Not
the
Maine. Maine has a district. So Maine and Nebraska divide their electoral votes by district, and then they award points for the overall state. So Maine is a blue state, solid blue state, but it has a solid red congressional district, and the way they allocate the electoral college votes is that is partially by district, and so Maine. So Democrats don't get all of the state; they lose a couple of one electoral vote for losing the second district.
Thank you. I didn't know that detail. Thank you. What the Iowa professor said was that Iowa used to be competitive. We vote for Obama, vote for McCain based upon who had the right message that year and where America was. And
Ohio, look at
Ohio.
Florida.
Ohio is still purple, as I understand. And then they said Trump. I've heard from some political scientists it's still considered purple. I'll have to look into that more.
Well, I'm not an expert at that, but I mean, Ohio went squarely for Trump. In both elections.
The Rust Belt sweep he took in order to win. I remember the area the Clinton campaign neglected, and he had the governor of Michigan. There's a recorded phone call of the governor of Michigan to the Clinton campaign saying, "You better get up here with some campaign signs. I don't see any," and they totally ignored her. I remember that. The question was, these Iowa professors said, we were competitive. We're from Iowa. We're professors now, but we grew up here. We've been around here. We had seen it. Yeah, there was some conservatives and liberals, and yeah, there was extremists, but we're generally competitive back and forth. And your identity wasn't as wrapped up into it. And then Trump came, and everybody turned hardcore conservative. And even after Trump's gone, they're still hardcore conservative. And as an Iowan who's lived here for decades, I am scared at how polarized our previously competitive districts have gone. I'm afraid they'll never go back. Have you seen anything like that with these districts that were competitive and then went red in Minnesota?
No, it's hard to say. I mean, the districts, at least the first district, which is a district that was formerly occupied by the current governor. I mean, that is not a district that is unattainable for the Democrats to win again, and the same is true with the 8th. And for all I know, the 7th. The 2nd is very competitive. And so there are swing districts, mainly the 2nd.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on Minnesota politics, but
I'm not there. That's why you're there. I wanted to see if just you, not just as an academic, as an American with two eyeballs, like, what did you see? Have you seen these?
Yeah, I can almost speak more as an American with two eyeballs.
An American with two eyeballs, have you noticed things got more polarized in these districts that supposedly went from competitive to red?
I did, yeah. So at one point when the last Democrat to hold the seat in the 8th, I can't remember his name, he held the seat early in the 70s, and then he came back and held it again, for a couple terms, or at least one term, in the, I think it was 2012 or 2014, not 2014, but it didn't look any different, but it played out differently. And I think that probably what was happening was the dynamism with respect to rural and urban polarization. So it's another way to think about polarization. It didn't look any different. I think what happened was politics began to focus in symbolic ways that moved rural voters to the right and urban voters to the left. And so if you look at just rural urban polarization, that is a fairly recent feature. That's 15, 20 years old. Did not used to exist.
They're showing from 1990 to 2000, it was happening. Before the advent of social media, before the advent of gerrymandering, before the advent of elite politicians. That was one of the questions.
Gerrymandering.
But well, as I understand from political scientists, gerrymandering got started around 2000. It didn't actually get going hardcore until 2010. Social media, maybe you could say 2010, didn't get going hardcore until 2015. Extreme politicians, roughly 2017 to 2019. The big sort goes back to 1992, and it shows half of America just polarizing before any of these other things came online. And that's why I'm asking, like, is it possible to undo this? And did you, as an American, notice that things got more polarized? Not as an academic, just as an American, because some people are saying they're worried that's what's happening. Is that maybe they never go back to being? I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think. That's why I'm asking you
There was
guys.
an era of polarization that preceded this one, and that was succeeded by an era of depolarization.
Okay.
So it is to say that this is, a forever, aspect of politics. And it's hard at the moment to see how the country could become less polarized. But it may be, that large shocks to either the economic system or in the international space would, create a somewhat different, dynamic here, domestically. But I think for the foreseeable future, we are going to see secular change that has continued to increase polarization, as we've seen it. So I don't, I think the most likely thing is just continued, acceleration of what we've seen before. Now, again, you might not have a figure like Donald Trump, so it might take on a different hue. It might look a little different, once Trump is out of the picture. There might not be a personality that, that tends to, create, as much of a kind of a cult-like, following.
Right.
And that itself might take the edge off. It may be that, typically what parties do is they change when they no longer think they can, continue to win with what they're doing. So, if it tends to be that Trumpism overall is sort of losing prospect, which, aside from 2016, looks like it is, right? So 2 congressional elections, 2018, 2022, and then the 2020 presidential election. So, Ron DeSantis his argument at the moment is that, Trump's a loser. I win, he loses. And so it may be that there is something broader about Trumpism that gets kind of tarnished if it continues to lose. But the Republicans really did, or Trump himself really did put up some marginal people in the Senate races that he went on to lose, and in the House of Representatives.
Dr. Oz? I don't want to get into it. I'm just joking. I'm just.
I wouldn't even put him in. I wouldn't even put him in the top tier.
I want to ask you as a psychologist question. So a lot of the reading on political polarization, how do we come together by Matthew Lewandowski, and how do we fix this, and how do we have our kumbaya moment? And what they're saying is you have to have positive interactions with the other side that have to be done correctly. You can't just have interactions with the other side. That could go really bad. You got to have positive interactions with the other side, meaningful, done the correct way. That's what I hear a lot of. My question for you is, when we're looking at this map, we see a highly polarized voting at the county level. Is a Republican in San Francisco, California, going to have the same opinions as a Republican from rural Kentucky?
Probably not, but Republicans, so looking at this map should not lead you to believe that there aren't people who disagree with you, who are in, either your space, or close in proximity to you,
Sure.
or who are not in your social network. So there's been a lot of work on social networks, and how completely homogeneous politically are people's social networks, and most people are friendly with and discuss politics with some people who they disagree with, and that tends to have a salutary effect on polarization. It tends to decline it. That is, people tend to see the rationale of people's positions. They tend to to caricature the other party in less in less simplistic ways. And so there it was still the case. So the prescriptions that Matt includes in his book, and while I haven't read the book in a while, I did participate in a workshop when Matt was writing it.
Awesome.
The kinds of things that he writes about, the experiments that he includes, are all ones that we would characterize as having high external validity. That is, that they are things that would happen in the real world.
Right.
So maybe we need we need a way to push people to find it palatable to talk to people who are from the other side. So I have a very good friend who is very conservative, and he teaches me things about politics. He corrects a lot of what I believe, because I am like anybody else. When I take my political science hat on and I put my partisan hat on, I think things that are probably at least partially wrong, and he corrects me. And he also makes arguments that I haven't heard, because I'm living in an echo chamber as much as anybody else.
Sure.
As much as any other engaged person. Although I try to read, from all sides, or at least, think that the people who disagree with us are not either crazy, stupid, or evil.
Reduce the affective polarization.
Yeah, to reduce the affective polarization, exactly. Yeah. So I think that there are ways, but we have to be intentional about them. And people have to be. There are organizations that are doing this, and what cumulative effect they're having, I don't know, but I think that there does need a greater interest, whether on the part of citizens. College students, for example, are really clamoring for a less polarized classroom environment, and universities are often giving that to them by offering courses that are designed to include both sides. We have a public life project here at the University of Minnesota that has programming that includes curriculum, includes meaning courses taught that help people to understand the nature of polarization. And we also
Great.
we many of us are members of what's called Heterodox Academy, where we are trying to advance the notion that a pluralistic society, one that takes that incorporates just high level of political tolerance, is one that is beneficial to everyone. And so there are forces there are more angelic forces out there.
Sure.
They might be harder to find. The algorithms that tend to operate on social media are not ones that provide you with a balanced diet. So you have to go out and be more intentional about it. But most of us have people in our lives who have different political orientations, ones that are different from ours, and if those are longstanding social connections, friends, family members, they can have a very good influence.
Sure.
On leading people to believe that the other side, has a reasonable position on an issue. I'm going to need to wrap this up in about 2 minutes.
Let me reframe the question.
Sure.
You're saying, hey, I'm reaching out to the other side. You live in San Francisco, California. You're a liberal. You go down to Starbucks and you hang out with a Republican in San Francisco, California, who agrees gay people have the rights to not be harassed, and women have the right to their bodies. And but they're very big on taxes, and that's why they voted Republican. I have family in Texas, and they're nothing like that. They are hardcore Christian, military, football, all the cultural types. And so if I talk to my stepdad who voted for Trump but lives in San Francisco, versus I talk to my cousin who voted for Trump and lives in Texas, I'm getting two very different perspectives. And for me to say, I had a conversation with my stepdad in downtown San Francisco and we agree, see, all Democrats and Republicans agree, is not true. Because the real interaction would be, I would need to talk to a Republican who lives outside of my landslide voting district to actually have an interaction with somebody who really thinks differently, because they're going to be reflective of their environment.
Fewer people, in lopsided spaces are going to, you're going to find fewer people in those spaces. But it
Sure.
doesn't say that you're going to find nobody. Not only that, but people, have connections that are not geographic. We can now transcend geography through social media, and those are people who are meaningful to us and who communicate with us. And so, it isn't the case that we've gotten to a point. If you look at that, that 2020 map, that there are just no blue people living in those deeply red spaces, or no red people living in blue spaces. It's not true. It really, I think, depends in part on people's psychological predispositions, if you want to bring psychology into it, to be interested, or at least to tolerate people who are different from them. And some people are better at that than others, or at least have the capacity to tolerate levels of differences in beliefs, behavior, people, and all, and so on. And that's something that is relevant in both parties. It tends to, those who are not tolerant in that way tend to be more extreme, both as Democrats and as Republicans.
I just remember it was a book by Pankaj Ghemawat where he said, although the internet allows us to connect to people around the world, the most average person spends 95% of their internet time talking to people in their local community. They don't actually reach out to people outside, just because that's what we see. Okay, 2 last minute questions for you. I hope that you found this was a fair interview. This was not gotcha journalism. You got to say your piece. We didn't try to put words. Okay.
It was wonderful. And you're extremely well informed. I'm duly impressed.
Thank you.
Maybe I should have been interviewing you.
Hey, we can set it up. Do you have any recommendations? Do you know anybody who, you don't have to, but do you know anybody who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? Don't have to, but we're just wondering.
I know a million people. How about if I send them? I'll send you a list.
Thank you. And I hope you found we did a fair job. They can see all the other videos we did. We just want to keep talking to people about, and thoughtfully.
I think it's wonderful. Thank you for reaching out to me, and keep doing the good work that you're doing.
Thank you. I'm going to show this video to my mom, so that's going to be great. I'll see her tonight, and
that's high praise.
It is. She's going to go, oh, look at you, my baby. Okay, I'm not doing it. We're keeping it professional. Last question for you. Okay, Mom, I'm not doing it. We're going to keep it professional. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person. You don't know who this person is. You don't know how they think. You don't know what they're about. But they watched this video, and they watched it, and they go, wow, there's a lot of material there. And it's 5 days from now. And they're going, I watched this video. There was a lot there, and I don't remember it all, but there was this one thing the professor said, and boy, I cannot get it out of my head. What is that one thought you want a random person you've never met to not be able to stop thinking 5 days from now?
Oh, that's a good question too. I guess I would say it's this, that, and it's not something that we covered extensively. It's something that I just mentioned in passing, but that we want to get people to a point where they cease to believe that those people who think differently than they do are either stupid, crazy, or evil. That people have a reason to believe what they believe, and that reason is not a reason that renders them outside the realm of acceptability. And I think that goes a long way toward both informing people about what the positions of the parties are and what the distribution of public opinion is, but it also has a softening effect. The hard-edged, sort of sensationalistic way that polarization is presented, often exaggerates the extent to which people are capable and often are engaging in political crosstalk in ways that have, these beneficial effects. And in the ambivalent partisan, we explored who those people were, why people become ambivalent partisan. It wasn't seen as being kind of a personality thing. It was seen as being something that was more kind of situational or contextual. And so what I'd like people to remember is that, polarization and increasing polarization is not inevitable. And not only that, but even when it's high, there, are millions of people who might even be strong partisans themselves, but who think deeply and even-handedly about politics, at least much of the time.
That's deep.
That's my answer.
That's deep. That's one of the better ones. That's deep. I always like asking that question because I have no clue what I'm going to get, and it's always kind of a surprise every time. We'll leave it there.
Good question to ask. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I will email you a copy of the video shortly. I appreciate any recommendations, and we want to say thank you so much for coming out, Professor. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for taking on theoretical questions. Not everybody in the academic field is willing to, and I get it. I get it. But we really appreciate you being willing to do some theoretical questions that, you know, you have to stretch out from what we know exactly from the study. It helps the public understand and digest the material, and we really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. It was a great way to spend an hour and 35 minutes and 22 seconds.
Okay, we're going to stop because this is becoming a bigger video that I got to show my mom, like, look at all these recommendations I got.
So I don't want to watch all this. You're going to have to skip around. Look at you know, choice moments. But it was very nice being with you.
Thank you so much. I will email you shortly.
Thanks. Okay. All right. Have a good evening and weekend. Take care, Mark. Bye-bye.